Get going here. Welcome everyone to the April 22nd City Council work session. Welcome to everyone here and at home. One thing you don't see on the agenda is a resolution that Claire is going to bring forward as we table.
Hi, this is Alan.
Hi, Alan. I'm just saying that the first thing up before your resolution is Claire is going to make a motion to put back on the table her the one that she had on the Willamette Fall locks. So we're going to start off with that.
Right, good. Okay.
Okay.
So if I get a second, I'd like to reopen or put back on the table my resolution from March 9th on the reopening the Willamette Falls.
Second.
Seconded.
So thank you for giving me a few moments to speak to this motion. When I brought it to you back in March, we didn't have a lot of background information, and since then, Lisa Nieto, who's part of the effort to move this Willamette Locks project forward, is here in case we have some questions, and she's also shared with us the Echo Northwest report that came out at the end of 2014 that really speaks to the economic potential of reopening the Willamette Locks. And I also shared that information with you via email, as well as copies of resolutions from, I think, West Lynn and a couple of other cities and some other materials. So I'm hoping that this time around we feel more informed about the issue and that we, as a council, will endorse the idea that the Willamette Locks have great economic, social, and cultural potential for our community, even all the way up closer to Portland, and will support the resolution that's before you.
Thank you for bringing this forward, and I'm happy to have Lisa Nato here. She and I served in the legislature together many years ago, so it's good to have her in our community and see her again. And I certainly support this.
And the point of order, so it was on the table and it was moved and seconded
Now we're just
before.
putting it back on the table, then we have to vote on it, right?
Okay.
Right.
So now you're voting on bringing it back on the table. There's no debate, right? Is that true? Because we tabled it, there's no debate?
There is debate. There's no debate to put it on the table.
But debate
to table it.
To take it up.
Oh,
Put
really?
it back.
So we're just voting
We're
on
voting unless anybody has anything they want to say. Okay, all those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Councilor Malenka?
Yes.
7 in favor. Councilor Evans is not here, so 7-0. It passes. It's back on the table, and now we're ready to vote on it. Are there any discussion? Comments? All right. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Councilor Zelenka?
Yes.
7 in favor, none in opposition. It passes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Thank you.
Next up is Councilor Zelenka has a resolution supporting a carbon pricing policy for the state of Oregon. Councilor Zelenka.
Yes, I'd like to move to approve the proposed resolution, and I'd like to speak to it if I get a second.
Second.
Seconded. Please speak.
Yes, this is a general resolution about carbon pricing as a state policy. It's not, well, there's a lot of bills running around in the legislature right now. It's not specific to any bill per se. It mentions the PSU NERC study that they recently did that we had a report on that concludes that a carbon tax would have an extremely small impact on our economy. And that for the state to meet its greenhouse gas reduction target, the price on carbon, I think, is really necessary. I'm actually on my way to an Oregon Global Warming Commission meeting to discuss, in part, the biennial report to the legislature, and it says that while we've had a reduction in greenhouse gases since 1999 from 72 million metric tons to 61, we're still 11 billion metric tons above our 2020 goal, and including all the things that we're currently doing and the recently passed low carbon fuel standards, we won't meet our goal. And and the same is true for Eugene and our climate recovery ordinance report that we just said that we're not on track to beat our goal. And one of the things I keep thinking about is something that Bill McKibben said. He said there's no real silver bullet to solve climate change problem. It's really silver buckshot. We need a lot of tools to be able to do that. And one of the arrows that should be in our quiver is a carbon pricing tool. And as the PSU NERC study clearly shows, that if done right, it need not have an impact on our economy. I'd also like to point out that you also had a letter from the Sustainability Commission in support. They voted unanimously to support this resolution and move it forward from 350.org to the Sustainability Commission to me to you all. And so I urge my fellow councilors to support this resolution.
Thank you. Mike, I've got you in the queue, but before I call on you, I would like to read the communication you got from the Sustainability Commission. At its December 17, 2014 meeting, the Sustainability Commission voted unanimously to recommend that the City Council pass a draft resolution requesting that the state legislature impose a carbon pricing policy. In July 2014, the Council passed the nation's first climate recovery ordinance that codified our aggressive community and internal greenhouse gas and fossil fuel reduction targets and required a plan to meet the targets. Thank you for taking that bold step. As you requested through that ordinance, City staff is currently investigating the actions that will be required to meet those targets. It seems likely, perhaps even self-evident, that a statewide price on carbon will be essential if we are to meet Eugene's admirable and absolutely necessary greenhouse gas reduction goals. The Commission's hope was that the passage of the resolution would encourage legislative action at the state level, support Eugene's climate recovery ordinance, and provide the basis for lobbying in favor of any bills introduced at the legislative level which were consistent with the resolution and supportive of our CRO. Through statewide lobbying and supportive legislators, several bills have been introduced, and a hearing on 3 of them occurred on April 14th at the state capitol. These include House Bill 3470, Cap and Action Plan, House Bill 3252, Carbon Tax, and House Bill 3250, Cap and Dividend. Dr. Tom Potowski of Portland State's Northwest Economic Research Center has stated that he believes the goal of reductions in carbon dioxide emissions can be achieved by policies which either place a cap on emissions or place a fee on emissions. We request that Council discuss and pass the proposed carbon pricing resolution at its April 22nd work session. Thank you for your consideration. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. I have, as you all have at your place there, asked to have an intended amendment put on the table here, and I'll make that amendment in just a moment. But having read the PSU study, there were a couple of pieces that gave me pause and concern. So my amendments are predominantly targeted at those concerns, so that we do this appropriately. The legislature is likely to pass something, from what I understand. So if our effort by resolution is to lobby them appropriately, I want to make sure the right things go into state law. So I move to amend Section 1 of the resolution, Sub A, that the Council further requests a cap on pricing at $100 per ton of carbon, and Sub B, that the Council further requests that the net proceeds of the tax be proportionately returned to Oregon cities to prepare for the effects of climate change. And if I have a second, I'll speak to that.
I'll second.
Moved and seconded.
All right. The first one, all the modeling that was done in the PSU study that Alan mentioned was done at their proposed level of $60 a ton, with an annual increase of $10 a year thereafter without a cap. There was a caveat in the report that mentions that the modeling doesn't take into effect later years where that number might grow to something much larger, in which case it could have an economically negative effect, and that they had done some modeling with a cap. So this essentially allows for a few years of increases depending on what the legislature does. From what it sounds like, our resolution here says we'd like them to adopt what was the modeling in that, with this caveat then that makes it safer economically to cap at $100. The second one then is the net proceeds of this are not as clearly identified for an advantageous purpose. And for me, it's less of an argument about what we can do to stop climate change. Most of the conversations these days around the 275 parts per million mean that we've now passed and are over 400 parts per million, put us in a place when you look at long-term fossil fuel leases that and what happens in other parts of the world, in China and elsewhere. I think from the perspective of a local elected official, it is wiser and more responsible for us to begin to prepare for the effects of climate change rather than to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to stop it, because I don't know that we'll have as great an effect on that as we will making appropriate preparation. So I put in there that the monies raised by this tax would come back to Oregon cities proportionately so that we can begin the process, which we haven't really done to this point, of preparing for the impacts of climate change in our community.
Yes.
I'd just like to clarify, my understanding of the intent of your motion is that these are additions to 1A and 1B and not a substitution for what's in 1A and 1B.
No, these are additions. That's correct.
Councilor Brown?
Thank you, Mayor.
I'd like to be in the queue, Mayor.
Well, this is very interesting, but I think I don't know that I can support this because you seem like, the resolution is we're saying to the legislature that we support a carbon pricing policy, and we're not including a report like this. We're not getting that specific. We kind of want the legislature to do that. Otherwise, we might have like 20 or 30 or 40 other additions like this, and I think it's kind of premature to put a cap on it because once this goes if it does go into effect, if it does take root here in Oregon, we will have the example of Ireland to follow. We study their data in coming years. We'll study the data from British Columbia in coming years. Washington State and California. We'll be able to see whether we want to put a cap of $100, down the road. So I think it's premature to add this to the language now. And the second one, sub B, my understanding is that this modeling, the money would be raised by this tax would be repatriated to take care of corporate income tax, business and corporate income tax, as well as personal income tax. In other words, it would be fairly revenue neutral for the state if we just replace the tax. The state would get its operating money from this tax, and people would see a total, really big reductions in their personal income tax, and businesses would too. So I don't think I can support the second part of it either. Thank you.
Well, I was in the queue for the main motion, but I'll speak to Councillor Clark's proposed amendments. I tend to agree with Councillor Brown. I feel it's a little premature to get down into the details. I appreciate the thoughts and the logic behind the amendments, but I like the kind of high-level take that the resolution sits at now, so I would not support the amendments.
Councilor Zelenka?
Yeah, I was. Thank you, Councilor Clark, for reading the report. That makes a big difference, I think. I appreciate what you're saying, and I understand what you're saying. I purposefully had the resolution be a general policy statement about a carbon pricing policy at the state level. And I think like Councilor Surratt, Councilor Brown, that it's a little premature to put specifics on it. I think the more appropriate place to have those kind of conversations is when we're in conversations about a particular bill that has a particular pathway. And while the PSU study is really important in that it shows that if you do this right, you don't have an impact on the economy, it's not a proposal. It's more of a what-if study. What if this were true? What would happen to the economy? What if this happened? What would happen to the economy? And so I don't think I can support either the resolutions at this time or other amendments at this time. Thank you.
Chris?
Thank you. I appreciate the thoughtfulness because conceptually, I like the ideas here. I don't know whether pricing at $100 a ton, how that fits into larger conversations that other folks have had. I don't know whether it's been a factor in the conversation, whether the legislature's talked about that, what that might look like. And then the notion on having the proceeds be returned, and I heard so that we can prepare, but then I looked at item D. The council believes that assigning a cost to carbon dioxide emissions is one of the most efficient ways to decrease carbon pollution, discourage consumption of fossil fuels, and encourage development of alternatives. To me, that's the intended place where the money is supposed to go. So while we do need to prepare, and from that standpoint, I like that idea. I think if you had a fund of money you had collected, the purpose of that money would be to try to further D. I think that was the intent here. So you would want the money to go towards decreasing carbon pollution, discouraging consumption, and encouraging development of alternatives, as opposed to preparing for something that may be inevitable. With that, I would probably give you credit for. So I would be concerned about putting that in there if it was going to have the impact of decreasing our ability to address the items in D. So maybe we could go ahead and approve this, but then some continued thought about how we should address preparing for it, because I do think that is still an outstanding issue that still does need to be addressed with. So I don't think I would probably support these two at this point. I would probably go ahead and support adopting this, but I think you've raised points that warrant some additional conversation about what do we do at the local level to prepare ourselves for what possibly is an inevitable outcome, and we do need to do something productive around that. And I appreciate bringing up that idea, because I do think we probably will need to talk about that.
I concur with all the comments that have been made and the appreciation for bringing up this for discussion. I will say that in every conversation that I've had around dealing with climate change, we've always talked about reduction of impact and resilience. And resilience is all about how you deal with what's coming. So both of those things are in the broad conversation right now. I hear it in every conversation. So, and some of the things that we will be doing here in our city will be to reduce the impact, and some of it will be to be resilient as things change. When you talk about climate refugees and things, I mean, those are things that are going to have to be dealt with and are in our current sphere of thinking. So, yes.
Thank you, Mayor. I just want to say in response that clearly the methodology in the PSU study did show and recommend specific dollar amounts in response to what George said. I appreciate what you're saying, but in section D here, in section 1, it is very specific that what we're asking for in this resolution is for the legislature to craft statute based on the specifics of what we're asking. And in section 1, it says that we'd like them to carefully craft legislation to impose a carbon pricing policy, in part relying on modeling described in this particular report and in the experience of British Columbia, which is also a part of that. So in other words, we're asking them to do some very specific things, the legislature. And specifically in that report, all of the studying was done with a base assumption of $60 per ton tax with an annual increase of $10 a ton. And it was clearly talked about in there about the modeling that at some point it I don't know how to say this right. The modeling makes it negative, creates a negative impact on the economy at some future X point that they didn't say, because you couldn't go on forever until it's thousands of dollars per ton without a negative effect on the economy. They did say that it would be helpful for consideration of a cap. That's why I put that. My $100 was arbitrary. With the other piece, though, here's the thing that's important to me on this. And Chris, this isn't something that we're suggesting the money should be used for reductions. I'm saying we're already making plans for reductions here in Eugene. We've got our energy and action plan, but we can't, from Eugene, change what happens in the rest of the world. Okay? What we can do is model a good example, and I think we're doing that. But the effects are still going to be felt in Eugene from what everybody else is doing. And right now, we're not spending much of any, we're having the conversations at a high level, but we haven't allocated money and begun to make specific plans for what we're going to do at impacts. We're seeing what's happening in the drought in the Southwest, and we're seeing the impacts already, and we're not as far along on that level. And I have to say, I can't support this just to, as George mentioned, return the money to big corporations as a tax break. I don't want to do that. If we're going to create this carbon tax to lessen or to have people pay for that particular element, then I'd like to see us not give tax breaks to big companies just to, because we want to punish people for bad behavior. Let's start planning for something that's effective. Otherwise, I don't know that I can support the resolution.
Before we vote on this, I did want to point out that in Section 1 of the resolution, it says, in part relying on modeling described in the reports outlined in the above findings and the experience in British Columbia. So it isn't they're not suggesting that be the totality of the conversation. And I would also say, urge you, actually, Mike, that I think the things you brought up are important things for us to be discussing. I would really suggest that you prime those up for a future work session. This is, in fact, giving very general direction and saying, take a look at this. We think this has good possibilities. And I think your points are well taken, that we could spend some time talking about these other things. And in particular, I think for us to really drill down on how we're going to respond to the things that are coming at us rapidly right now. Mm-hmm. So I would recommend that and then you can alter the resolution at some point if you want, but people will have had time to talk about it and look at it and think about it. So, well, I guess we're ready to vote on this. All those, we're voting on Mike's. All those in favor of Mike's motion. One.
Two.
No.
Okay, so we have 2 in favor, in opposition. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in opposition. So it does not pass. We're back to the main motion. All those in favor of the main motion, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4. Councilor Zelenka?
Yes.
5 in opposition. 2, it passes. Thank
Hey,
you all.
Mayor.
Yes.
Who is in opposition?
Pardon?
Who is in opposition?
Councilor Polling and Councilor Clark.
Thank you.
I just want to be really clear about why I voted no on the resolution, and it's again because I offered the amendment about where the money goes. And this is a critical part of this. We're saying to the legislature, we want you, by passing this, we want you to take all this money at the pump, essentially, in gas prices. Because when a carbon tax is put in place, the distributor is the one that has to pay for it. They'll raise your gas price. And then on the backside, that same distributor is going to get a tax break. And if you believe that they'll pass that money along to folks at the pump, well, then that's your belief. I don't particularly believe that. So I'm not in favor of the idea of giving tax breaks to big oil companies so that we can try and change people's behavior. I'd rather see that money come to Eugene so we can prepare.
Ready to move move on.
Mayor?
Yes,
Mayor,
Councilman.
can I say one more thing? I appreciate what you said, Mike, but none of that was said in the resolution. It's a general statement about a policy position about climate change and pricing policy, and it's really convenient to be able to say, I don't support it because of this specific thing that's not in the resolution. And we can debate those finer points at a different time when a bill comes before us, but to be noted that there were two in opposition to a general policy about carbon pricing at the state level.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next item for today, which is a report to the City Council from the police auditor. Mark, welcome.
Thank you.
Brought your partner here.
About the brains of the organization. For our viewing audience, I'm Mark Gissner, police auditor. To my right is Deputy Auditor Leah Pitcher. Madam Mayor, Madam President, we're here today to talk about our study of use of force that we conducted probably about 5 or 6 months ago.
Could Mark get closer to the microphone?
Yes, sorry.
Is that okay, Councilor Zelenka? Can you hear him now?
Test 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, it's better.
All right.
Not great, but better. Thank you.
I'm not here every week, so I'm not used to the echo. So we prepared this report several months ago, and it was postponed. And since that time, of course, there's been a lot more national discussion about police use of force, and particularly deadly force. So this is a good time to have a conversation about this issue. We think that one of the most important trend analyses that we can do in our office is to do studies like use of force in our city. In a little bit of background, in April of 2013, there was implementation of a software program called Blue Team, which is a subset of a greater program called IAPRO. And in essence, it's incident-based reporting by supervisors, and it includes, but not limited to, use of force, police pursuits, vehicle accidents, risk claims, search and seizure issues. So we took that data from 2013 on force and took a look at that. We look at this Blue Team entries every day because we do want to know what's going on. And in addition, in terms of force, I try to make it a habit of looking at the daily Eugene Internet reporting that includes mugshots to make sure I don't see anything in particular that looks odd to me. So we use those systems. In addition, many command staff at EPD looks at the Blue Team reports. The Blue Team transitioned from a model in which officers were the primary reporter of their own force to a system in which supervisors are now the primary responder and reporter of force. So we get a lot quicker timeline on preliminary investigations of use of force, and it's helpful for us to understand where situations occur and hopefully where intervention should occur when necessary. I will say of the 130 cases that we studied, it is to some degree subjective in that I try to identify what I think is the primary use of force that causes a person to be taken into custody. Someone else might have a different opinion. Just briefly before we start the slides, and the report and the slideshow are both on the City Council agenda website, and we'll have that address at the end. We found that in about 9% of the cases involved, it involved either a person actually with a gun or reported to have a gun. 9 more involved knives, 9 involved objects that could be used as weapons, and 9 involved a person actually striking an officer with fists or kicks. We found no particular pattern in any one officer being involved. Of the 130 cases, there were 66 different officers involved. And again, I appreciate that, comparatively speaking, nationwide, we have a fairly modest database. And so having several years out will give us a little bit more idea if there are patterns, but at this point in time, we found no patterns. About 57% involved one use or use of force by one officer only. 15 people were specifically identified as experiencing a significant mental health issue by the author of the report. In my individual review, it was my opinion that there were more. In addition, numerous people I felt were suffering from significant alcohol or substance abuse. And then we found that the average experience of the primary officer was about 9.4%. So with that little prelude, then we'll start the slideshow. Of the 130 uses of force report, the number one reported conduct was active resistance, which is not particularly surprising, as you can see, and probably one of the glitches in Blue Team is there's a statistic there for the actually armed and reported or believed armed and edge blade knives, so they probably need to design software that maybe captures or consolidates a number of those things, but that's what's marked by the sergeants. Next, please. Of the total count of force used, you see graphs where the sergeant felt or the lieutenant felt whether something was effective or not effective. As you can see, most of the force used was considered effective. One that was probably considered least effective was the taser, but that includes taser points, and so that would be most of the taser points. I think one of the things that I really appreciated this year is when I came here, I felt that the canines or dogs were used in situations that perhaps were not necessary. And I know there were some changes that were made, and I appreciate the fact that in only one instance a canine was used to apprehend someone. If you've ever had a dog attack you, it's a very unpleasant experience, and so I appreciate the discretion of the entire canine unit in making sure that when a dog is deployed, that it is a person who has conducted a felony crime or is considered dangerous or a high-risk flea. Okay. I'm aware when I came here that tasers were important to the community, and that was one of the things that we studied. Out of 130 cases in which there were 229 uses of force, there were 69 total taser uses. There were 25 actual deployments. Doesn't mean that they were effective because it depends on clothing and the technology isn't sometimes always precise. And 44 were just taser points. So there is some appreciation in the community of tasers, and in 2/3 of the cases, just the mere admonishment or threat of the use of a taser caused someone to comply. So I was pleased to see that. Sometimes people ask us why we keep track of that, and I think one of the reasons that we keep track of that is just to make this point about it being an effective tool to de-escalate a situation. For me, anything that helps not having a physical confrontation is of value to our community. Next, please. again, in terms of the uses of force and the total numbers involved, what I was trying to show here was to see whether there was a trend of or a pattern in which there would be some particular use of force that was more pattern-like in the number of officers involved. Again, as you can see, there were a lot of one-to-one ratios or close to one-to-one ratios in the things used. The firearm, of course, was Officer John's shooting over there at Churchill High School. The only one, again, was Taser Point. We do have a few officers who are very effective in communicating that a taser might be used if a person doesn't comply, and so that seemed to work out fairly well. Next, please. And out of the 130 incidents, 68 involved only a single use of force, and again, a Taser Point was 30 of those 68. It's, as I said before, an effective tool. You see the acronym PIT because I couldn't write it in there, but that's essentially when they use a police vehicle to spin another vehicle in a pursuit. That's another use of force that we consider if officers strike another vehicle with their vehicle, and again, that has been significantly reduced in the last several years, including high-speed chases. I believe that people can be captured without engaging in high-speed chases through our neighborhoods. Of course, when there's chasing a very dangerous person, then I think it behooves all of us to give room for officers to engage in that, but there's been a significant reduction in high-speed chases. In terms of injuries, first we see categories of officers injured during use of force, officers not injured, officers taken to hospitals, which was 5, officer not taken to hospital, 125, citizens injured was less than 50%. Citizens not injured was about 55%. Citizen taken to hospital was 28. And I wanted to ensure that people understood that also included folks who were taken to the University District Hospital for mental health evaluations and mental health situations. And I probably should have broken that down, and I got to remember to do that next year. But that was situation. One of the things that I found impressive, quite frankly, was we do have the injuries all indicated here, but they're, for the most part, minor injuries. There's one in there that indicates a loss of consciousness, which we weren't real sure about anyway, in terms of whether or not that was factual or not. So, and of course, other than a gunshot wound. So people were treated and released. I don't remember any specific case where someone was hospitalized, and I can't remember when we had the incident at the jail, if that was this year or not. But very rarely is someone hospitalized for a use of force by a police officer in the city of Eugene. They are taken there for treatment of lacerations, and this also includes, as Sergeant noting, when someone is treated by an EMT. We're all cognizant of the issues involving bloodborne pathogens, and so they'll usually err on the side of caution in those types of situations. Okay. For officer injuries, again, we've had, I think, a safe year for the most part, unless, of course, you're one of those folks that suffered some injuries. And so it was fairly light, mostly scrapes and scratches and bruises, one broken bone. And so I was pleased with that particular number. In each of the cases, there's assessments that officers make in discussions with their sergeants about what they think might be the primary cause of or the condition of the person at the time that the contact is made and force is made. So as you can see, the modes are alcohol and unknown. Again, others with emotionally troubled or known mental condition. Something, again, I think that I see increasing in our community. And I know we have 2 Cahoots fans. I'm not sure if that's enough, but I suppose that's a discussion for another time. Oh, I'd like to talk about it all the time. The charges involved, most, of course, were resisting arrest and assault. Several times they had to break up fights, and particularly when it involves family members. And one of our former law enforcement officials knows that when you try to break up a fight between family members, it usually turns on the person who's trying to break up the fight. And so in several instances, that's exactly what happened. I was somewhat surprised there was fewer uses of force on vehicle-type situations than I would have expected on traffic stops and DUIs and things like that. So that came as a little bit of a surprise for me. There were several situations, quite honestly, where people actually had firearms in their possessions, in their hands, when officers took them from them physically. And so that was a bit of surprise for me as well, other than in the Aaron Johns shooting. We also wanted to do a sex and race analysis, and for the most part, it mirrored what our population was. Again, I appreciate it's a very modest data set at this point in time, but we found no pattern other than the vast majority of force used was against white males. So go ahead. And for race, ethnicity, in comparison to the population, almost mirrored the population for whites, very slightly higher for African Americans, less than half for Latinos. If memory serves me, there were only, I think, 3 cases involving Latinos with 130 uses of force. Okay. One of the things I did, since I had an extra amount of time, I looked at 2014 as well with a glance, and one of the things that I wanted to make clear was that less than 0.1%, or about 1 per 1,000 of all physical arrests of African Americans resulted in reportable use of force, including taser points, what I consider to be a very low number, and less than 0.02%, or about 1 per 4,000 of all physical arrests of Latinos resulted in a reportable use of force, including taser points. If we took out taser points, I think we would be at about 1 per 1,200 or so on African Americans, and about 1 per 4,500 on Latinos, but I don't have those exact numbers. So again, what we're not seeing is a pattern there. And so that's the amount of time I gave for the presentation. As y'all know, I could talk for a long time. One other thing I wanted to point out, though, and I pointed out in our report, was typically a rate of less than 5% of arrests is what a target should be for use of force, and Eugene was about 1.4%. I also have data from about 30 different cities that compile the data, and Eugene comes out favorably. Not wishing to pick on a city like Cheyenne, Wyoming, but their indication was that 6% of their arrests involve force, and again, where Eugene, it's about 1.4%. And so it was just part of their annual report. It's sometimes difficult to find the data looking into these cities because sometimes it's apples and oranges. We're in the fruit family, but sometimes they do things differently. And they actually had more reportable uses of force annually than Eugene, despite the fact that Eugene arrested about 6 times as many people. So that was just one city for comparison. Again, I'm not picking on Cheyenne. I just found that they had data that was similar in terms of interpretation. So I'm ready for some questions, please. And
Have Mike and Claire and Betty in the queue. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, guys, for the report. Appreciate that. Appreciate the information, all the hard work to put that together. It's comforting to a degree for me to hear that proportionally or comparatively, the Eugene Police Department's use of force is smaller than many or a lot of other communities. That's good information. As someone who's been on the police commission for a little over 6 years working on issues around police policy, I have to say that in the last few years, I know a lot of work has been done around use of force. We had use of force policy review, we had taser policy review when we first brought those on. A lot of work has been done to kind of make sure that our officers are extremely well trained and that they're implementing the right policies the right way. It's good to know in the reflection of these numbers that it seems to be working. One of the things that I hear in the news these days quite a bit are concerns around things like chokeholds and some of the other things that we see in the news around police use of force. I notice on this that of the 181 incidents of force, 130 cases, there were 46 control holds, and that was this last year. Did I have that right? Of those control holds, how many of them were what you would call a choke hold or carotid hold?
I'm not aware since 2009, since I've been here, and it doesn't mean it didn't happen because Blue Team just started in 2013. I'm not aware of one instance where someone attempted a carotid hold or a choke hold. I think that there is, as you said, from police commission policy and discussions, it's a very risky maneuver, and so I suspect that officers understand that, but I'm very sure that since April of 2013, it has not occurred.
And I can't remember an incident based on my knowledge, but I don't know, I don't do as deep a work in this as you do on a regular basis. Are you aware of any cases in Eugene where we've used a chokehold?
Not since 2009, since I got here, no. Okay.
Would you speculate on why?
I think it's a very risky move, and
you think our policies are good to address that issue at this time?
I think so, and policies are one thing, and training are another, and experience are another. And of the three, the training and the experience are really the most important elements of it, because they do have to make split-second decisions. They are aware that I do have issues anytime there's force that involves the head. They're very aware of that. And when that does occur, they have a pretty high expectation that it's going to get a very thorough review by my office as well as the chain of command, because, again, those are far more risky situations. And so, but in terms of the carotid hold or the choke hold, I am not aware of one since I got here. Not that it hasn't happened. I'm just not.
In the news, you see that occasionally across the country. Are you aware of it happening frequently in other places?
Not that I'm aware of. No, I don't. I did consult with DOJ, and I know it's frowned upon. It was trendy, probably with the national television growth of professional wrestling, quite frankly. And but I would expect that most chiefs in this nation appreciate the fact that it is a very risky maneuver when you have other tools available at your disposal.
Thanks very much.
Okay, Claire and Betty, then Chris, and then George Poley.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate the work of your office, and I also appreciate your willingness to be very clear with the chief of police on what your expectations are in terms of use of force by our officers in our community. That, I think, is an important part of your job. I also want to really acknowledge the process that you helped implement around changing how we report use of force and how that is reviewed. What was the technical term?
It's called Blue Team, and I have to, I wish I could take a lot of credit for it. It was really pushed by Assistant Chief Carl Dorr when he got here. It was a tool that they had in Palm County, Florida, and it costs a little bit of money to purchase, and certainly there's a significant learning curve and a culture shift for supervisors. But the primary driver of the tool, of the purchase of the tool, was Chief Dorr or Assistant Chief Dorr, and we've utilized it in a very proactive manner. And I wanted to point out, in the last 5 days, there has not been a use of force.
Excellent. And thank you to Chief Kearns, who was here. Maybe he stepped out to take a call. But as well, it seems to me, and I've also been serving on the Police Commission, not as long as Councilor Clark, but I've been serving there recently. It seems to me that review has really embedded a deeper level of accountability and independent scrutiny in the use of force by our officers. And even as we reflect on situations like the recent tragic shooting death of a veteran by our police officers, we can't take for granted that we're not immune from some of the same controversial situations that other communities have experienced. So I know your office is part of that review of that recent shooting death as well. I was curious, a little different change in topic. Is there a policy around officers reporting injuries to themselves, such as a scratch or a minor sprain? And do you feel confident that you're getting officers to report those to? Is there some requirement that they do?
They're supposed to report it. I suppose for all of us, we come to work every day with aches and pains, and how we get those aches and pains as we age. But there is that expectation that they will report that, because we want to make sure that they're close to 100% as possible when they're in the field, because if there's a weakness there, that might cause a very dangerous situation. And I have to speak on what you mentioned about the most recent tragedy, and I sure hope that our federal government considers, with the growth of veterans hospitals in different cities, that our federal government start considering having their own mobile crisis teams for their veterans. We've been at war on and off for about 14 years now, and there's a lot of folks that are suffering. And 2 out of the 5 officer-involved shootings that have occurred since I've got here are people who many thought were suffering from PTSD. And certainly having mobile crisis teams in these veteran facilities that can respond 24/7 rather than relying on cities to fund places like Cahoots would be extraordinarily helpful, I believe. I appreciate they can't cover every inch of this nation, but I think it's about time that our veterans hospitals also have mobile crisis teams to respond to folks who are suffering from PTSD.
Yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that. Yeah. So the Police Commission is about to hold their annual planning retreat, and they, as well as I would assume your office, has been getting inquiries about some particular policies, and Councilor Clark mentioned one of those. So I just wanted to run a few past you and get your thoughts on those. And if you think they're in need of an update. One of them is actually a new policy that we're considering, which is we don't currently have a policy on how police should be dealing with folks who are filming their encounters while they are on the job. So I would welcome any thoughts, briefly, that you might have on us developing a policy around that.
Well, I think it's a good idea to have a policy. We first addressed one of these cases actually back in 2009, where we sustained against an officer and the supervisor because a young woman was filming an encounter. If you go on ride-alongs or you go on or if you're in the area, for example, of the bar district on Friday night, any encounter involving police, you see 20, 30, 100 cell phones all filming the same thing. Depending on the circumstance, there should be a distance requirement. If you're intoxicated and trying to film your intoxicated friend being arrested from a distance of about 6 inches, you're probably going to have some difficulty. If you're getting too close to the filming of someone who has a gun and was just involved in a road rage incident, you're probably going to have some difficulties. So officers expect that they'll be filmed. If you go out on party patrol, all you see is the light of the camera. So they're used to it. At the same time, they have to have a reasonable amount of distance. And in fact, recently there was a case where 2 officers were distracted by someone and turned away from the woman that they were arresting, who was highly intoxicated, and she immediately started banging her head on the door frame of the police cruiser. So again, there are consequences for distractions that not only involve officers but sometimes involve people in the community. So I think it's good to have a policy that's reasonable, and I know the state's looking at that issue as well.
And just to be clear for folks who might be concerned, the policy is to put some frameworks around how the police are dealing with the interaction, not to preclude people from filming the police encounters. That I want to be very clear about that. Do you think our policy on the use of deadly force on fleeing suspects needs to be reviewed?
I haven't looked at the policy lately. I think it's tailored after Garner versus Tennessee, the Supreme Court ruling. So I know that, well, the situation in South Carolina, I think the courts and the system have addressed that the way it should have been addressed. I think our policy is consistent with what national standards should be at this point in time. If you want to make it clearer and very specific, I suppose that wouldn't hurt too much, but we also, there's that line on that dangerous felon person. So
right.
I think the policy right now is solid, but I have to take a look at it again.
Yeah. I believe it also complies with what the courts have decided to as well. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So I've got Betty and Chris and George Poling in the queue, and I just wanted to pause for a minute and say we're hitting up against 1 o'clock. We have another discussion, but I think this is an important one, and we put it off before, so I think we should be complete about it. So I may end up apologizing to staff that you'll have to make a decision if we have 15 minutes left whether you want to use it for that next issue or not, but I'm not going to cut this one short because I think it's really an important and actually timely discussion. So, all right, Betty.
Thank you. And I was just thinking, I think the last time or two that Mark came, he had to leave without our discussing.
Yes.
Is that right? So I'm glad.
No, I was forced to leave, I think, yes.
I remember seeing you get up and leave without getting kicked. So this is interesting information. I think it's good that we don't have a lot of use of force. But do you think part of that, the low rate, is due to the fact that a lot of the arrests are for marijuana and things where people aren't likely to be violent?
I think that is a good theory that needs further study, the types of arrests that are made, and whether or not the traditional form of policing serves communities in the 21st century. And so there are arrests and citations, a number of them that do involve marijuana and methamphetamine and trespassing. I would if I was venture to guess, those would be some of the highest arrests that are made in our community. So that may have something to do with it, but it's not unlike anywhere else where arrests like that are similar. If you look nationwide, police departments the blueprint is essentially the same in terms of operational aspects of it. There are some communities that are modifying that blueprint, but traditionally in the United States, the blueprint's pretty much the same. But I don't think that that's the reason, but I think it is part of the equation.
I'm thinking we don't have a lot of violent crime here compared to some cities.
It's a blessing, that's for sure.
That's good. Yes. I take it you don't mention racial profiling. City Club just had a meeting about that, and other people have been talking about it. Do you think that there is not racial profiling here?
I don't know. With 13,000 arrests and 17,000 citations and hundreds of thousands of contacts, I don't know. So my expectation is when this data system that they're contracting with to gather this information provides that information, then we'll have a better idea of it. It also depends how people define it. I think in my own mind I have a pretty good idea of how it ought to be defined, particularly at the engagement stage. But at this point in time, I don't have the resources to study that volume of contacts and stops to make any decisions about whether or not it's occurring.
Well, I noticed from the figures that you do have here, it doesn't appear evident.
It's very low. It's very low.
And then I have some questions about, let's see, page 7 to start with.
On the slides or the reports, ma'am?
On the report.
I think we just lost that one.
Under ominous, on the middle of page 7. Got that? Where it says that it's an ominous resistance when exhibiting behaviors that can constitute an assault, or, and then the part I have a question about is the circumstances reasonably indicate that an assault or injury is likely to occur. What does that mean? What kind of circumstances would indicate that an assault is likely to occur?
The officers and the sergeants have some degree of discretion in terms of consideration of that. I view that, and what I've seen in the report is someone who's holding a gun or is reported to have a gun, someone who's holding a knife is reported to have a knife. There was a woman, I remember, with a club. So it's typically, or if I'm fairly large, but if I wasn't so large and I was faced with someone who was about 6'8" and 350 pounds and saying that I'm going to have a difficult time taking them to jail, I would consider that ominous. So I think that I reviewed all the cases personally, that term was not overused.
Okay. On page 11, says there were only 2 officers with greater than average taser points. Is that, I suppose you can't tell us what 2 officers?
No, ma'am.
And,
I wish I could.
and what, do you know whether they have been, whether anyone has investigated why those particular people had more taser points?
I think one of them has found it to be very effective as opposed to a physical confrontation. And I know that the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals considers it a moderate level of force, but in my view, any time that you can avoid a physical confrontation, it is a good outcome. And so there's one or two that that do use a taser point as opposed to going hands-on with someone or using pepper spray, and so far it's been effective. And I think probably a lot of that has to do with how that officer articulates the taser point. And so the articulation that they may use it and having it ready, I think, is convincing to someone, so that person's found it effective.
So this might be an indication of restraint rather than otherwise, then.
I'm hopeful.
Okay, and my last question, you probably can't answer. On page 17, two sustained findings. One involved an officer who delivered a focused blow to the back of a man after the man had been handcuffed. This happened less than 1 second after the handcuffing, and the officer self-reported. My question is, what happened to the officer?
I'm not allowed to comment on disciplinary matters. A sustained case means that they were disciplined, but I'm not allowed to comment on.
But there would be some penalty or something.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Oh, I've got Chris and George polling, and then Mike again in the queue. But before that, just to clarify a couple things.
Ma'am, I hate to interrupt. I just wanted to clarify, thanks to Leah, is that was a case that was reviewed by the Civilian Review Board.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, ma'am.
So for the public, would you explain why you cannot reveal names?
It is through the collective bargaining agreement and the Ohio Public, or Ohio, I wish it was Ohio.
Wish it was Ohio, huh?
The Oregon Public Records Law, several of the 468 exemptions they have for the release of public information. I think it's 458. And so it does make it more difficult for us, because then it requires that we ask for a lot of trust. And it would be far more my preference if the community had access to all the administrative information for all of it, not all of us, not just police officers, but for every public employee. But that's not the case in Oregon.
The reason I bring that up is I think sometimes people think it's our personal decision to not reveal information. I just want to be sure they understand that this is part of Oregon law, and also the outcome of what happens when they've been found to have not performed their duties appropriately. We don't know what happens, but we know something happens, and that's what the law requires as well. Yeah.
Thanks for pointing that out. Yes.
And the other thing I wanted to ask you about was the we have do we have what goals for the numbers of arrests that officers are trying to achieve here?
I'm not aware ever of goals, but I don't manage the Eugene Police Department, and so I don't know what the standards of performance are for individual officers.
All right, Chris.
Was that the same as the quota?
A goal, yeah. The goal is 0. That probably would be the best goal.
Well, I do know that over time we have talked about whether officers are expected to have a certain number of arrests on their as a performance standard, and so that was why I brought, because I think Mark would be okay with saying that he thinks we have kind of an extraordinary level of arrests here. So
We have a high per capita rate, comparatively speaking.
Chris.
Thank you. With all the information in the news and the stories that have come up, it's inevitable that we're going to say, this is something that's gone on. It's attracting a lot of interest nationwide. How do we compare? as a community. That's why I think it's very timely that we have this information. It's very powerful to have this information, not only on an absolute level, how are we doing, but also on a comparative level, how are we compared to some of these issues that have come up in other cities. It also allows us to act very responsibly and very knowledgeably when we try to figure out what to do. So I'm very grateful that you have compiled this information and that Blue Team has allowed us this information. As time goes by, we'll see a lot more, but even with a one-year snapshot, knowing as statistically imprecise as it may be for 1 year, it is still very informative comparatively for how we are standing up with other communities. I think the 1.4% use of force is an amazing number. It shows that we have a longstanding policy to try to not use force if it's at all possible. And I think that's a reflection of kind of the work of a lot of people. It's no one person who just decides we're not going to use force if we can avoid it. The chief obviously takes a great deal of credit for leading that, but also the officers on the force itself. Because you can have a chief who can say, I want this to be the case, but the officer on the street is making decisions, and it's nice when they're trying to make decisions that they also believe reflect that same sense of proportion. You as an auditor and your staff, I think, have been an important element in trying to maintain that dynamic, as has the Civilian Review Board, which I think has been a very important element for us. But a last one is that there is a community value here that says if we can try to resolve criminal and civil issues in, for lack of a better word, a civilized way, that's the ideal. And while it can't always be done in every instance, as we see our own statistics show, to be at 1.4% means, to a great degree, it is working. We are resolving an enormous number of contacts and incidents without having to resolve to force. And I think, to a great degree, we want to do it as a community, which has already been pointed out. But we also have a chief and a police force and a staff that say we also want to have the mechanisms that can allow us to try to achieve that level. So it puts my mind at ease when I read stories in the media that say there's a lot of some very unfortunate things that are going on within police departments across the country. But to the degree we know from our own statistics, at least it's not happening here to a degree that we need to be concerned about.
And my restlessness comes from what I think are inadequate resources to respond to people who are suffering from permanent or temporary mental health issues. And it makes me restless a lot.
George Pulley.
Thank you. Mark, in a way, I'm kind of glad that your presentation got postponed, especially to today. I think we all need to take a moment of time sometime during our day today and remember that 4 years ago today, we lost one of our finest. Yeah. And in fact, at 1 o'clock, they had a wreath-laying ceremony at the site that Officer Kilcullen was killed in the line of duty. And I think we just need to take a little time to remember that. But also, kind of on the subject, but not, it's also the day that the Board of County Commissioners voted unanimously to appoint Chief Deputy Byron Trapp as the sheriff once Tom Turner leaves. And I would just like to congratulate Sheriff Trapp. I remember he was coming to the jail. I was a sergeant at one of his first sergeants when he first came on the sheriff's office. So I think the Board of Commissioners did an excellent job on their process and an excellent job on selecting their next sheriff, at least until May of 2016. Now, back on topic a little bit. I'm really pleased with the fact that this report's come out with the numbers that it has and the statistics, especially, like Chris said, in light of what's been going on nationally, some of the things that we've been seeing on the news. To me, as a ex-law enforcement officer, is really troubling and embarrassing, and I am certainly glad that we have not had to suffer through any of those type of incidents with our department. I think some of the things that these numbers are proving out is, one, Mark, is that your job, your function as a police auditor, is helping. I think the fact that our officers take pride in the work that they're doing is helping, the type of training that they're receiving. I think it's just a real collaborative effort on everybody's part. You and your staff, the chief, all the way down to all of his line people, and as well as the people in the community, because a lot of incidents that spiral out of control is, at least on my experience, was a lack of respect. You treat somebody the way you want to be treated, and I, working as a sheriff's officer a number of times where I could have resorted to use of force, but was able to actually avoid that based on the way I conducted myself with the person. I think our officers have gotten that message. They know they're being watched closely, not only by their supervisors, the auditor, the Civilian Review Board, but by the hundreds of little cameras that are out there. So I think we're on the right track. I'm proud of our department. I'm proud of the work that they do, and I'm curious to see how these numbers continue on out in the future. I'm sure there probably would be very little change.
And I just wanted to take a moment to thank Leah Pitcher and Vicki Cox from our office. They do extraordinary work. The Civilian Review Board is very engaged and does their homework when they before they come to the meeting, and we have great discussions on issues, not big crowds, but great discussions. So I just encourage people in the community to come and watch their work. I think we're notified well, and we receive on a per capita basis a significant number of police complaints compared to even some of the largest cities in the nation. And so I encourage the community to consider attending some of those meetings.
I'll get back into the queue.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to kind of take off on what George was saying and to appreciate all the involvement we have around policing in our community, not only from the fact that our auditor and his office does a fantastic job making sure that investigations done by behavior of officers, that they're following the policies that we set, are done so openly and so directly to council so that everyone's accountable in the process. I appreciate, and it gives me comfort to know from serving on the police commission, that the rules for how officers do their job are set with a great deal of citizen input from the police commission. I want to recognize that Maury Denner is in the audience out here, who served as the chair of the police commission for a number of years and did a lot of work, especially around a lot of these policies with use of force and others, to make sure that our officers do the right thing. We have the auditor in place for making sure that they do. And in relative to that, I wanted to touch on a piece that Betty mentioned around the issue of racial profiling, to say that I'm comfortable knowing that our community has one of, if not the best, policies for how police are supposed to behave around the issue of racial profiling. This year, the Police Commission wrote a new bias-free policing policy that gives them very clear and specific instruction about how they are to and how they are not to behave with regard to those issues, and that this policy was recently approved. Let's see here. Yes. This policy was so good that it was recently endorsed by the chair of the Governor's Law Enforcement Contacts Commission, the folks who deal with the issue of police contact. And it was adopted as the new state standard for the entire state of Oregon. So it gives me great comfort knowing that the work that the commission did, and specifically the subcommittee on issues around racial profiling, to know that we have the most up-to-date policy around that issue so that our officers are behaving in the appropriate way.
I'll pass. Thank you.
So I just wanted to circle back around to something that I know our auditor here thinks about and cares about a lot, the mental health issue. And I know we all care about that a lot. And I think we're going to have to continue to work on that as probably the the best tool we have for people from running into the law and to have a safer city. So I think we have to address that and it's very difficult because we don't have the resources and we don't have a lot of the things we need to do that. So I just appreciate it. I know you're working on that individually as well as in this role. So I want to thank you for that. I think it's hugely important. And I'm going to bring to you guys, I was asked by NAMI today to see if we would be, as a council, be willing to sign on about our responsibilities in trying to address that issue, not as a service provision, but as a partner in trying to work across the community on dealing with mental health issues. So I will send that out to all of you. And I did have one suggestion, Mark, and that is I think this is an issue that the community broadly cares about. Some of them are watching, either going to the CRB or the police commission, and they're looking in those places. Some people will watch this today, but the vast majority of people may not. And so I really would personally recommend that you might write an op-ed or something, kind of giving your take on how things are going in our city that sort of reflects this information in a way that can be, if you can condense it and share it, I think the community would like to hear how we're doing. So I would recommend that you do that.
Okay, will do.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your time.
With that, we're done with the business of the day.